There's a photograph kept in a safety deposit box in northern Indiana. It shows 11 people standing in front of a white clapboard church. The year is 1928. They're dressed in their Sunday best, faces pale and solemn. But if you look closely at the bottom corner, someone has taken a pen and crossed out 3 of the faces. Just black ink drawn directly over their features. No explanation, no names written beneath. The photograph was sealed away for 66 years. And when it was finally opened, the person who found it made a single phone call to the County Historical Society and said only this: "I think my family lied about everything." What happened to the Dalton family wasn't just hidden. It was surgically removed from public record, buried beneath false documents, and protected by a silence so complete that even the descendants didn't know the truth. Until a routine DNA test in 1994 pulled back the curtain on something that should have stayed buried. This isn't a story about scandal, it's a story about bloodline, about what people are willing to do to erase their own history, and about the moment when that history comes crawling back. Hello everyone! Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Dalton family of Grant County, Indiana, were respected people, farmers mostly, with a few school teachers and one circuit preacher mixed in. They kept to themselves, but attended church every Sunday without fail. They paid their debts. They buried their dead in the Methodist cemetery on the hill, where the stones are old and the moss grows thick. For nearly a century, no one questioned their story. No one had reason to. But in the summer of 1994, a woman named Margaret Dalton Hayes submitted her DNA to a genealogy project at Indiana University. She was 63 years old, childless, and curious about her roots. She expected maybe a connection to some distant European ancestry, perhaps a tie to the original settlers who'd come over in the 1800s. What she got instead was a letter from the university's research department asking her to come in for a follow-up interview. They told her the results didn't make sense. They told her there was something in her genetic markers that contradicted everything in her family's official records. And then they told her something that made her go completely silent. According to the DNA, Margaret Dalton Hayes should not exist. The Dalton family arrived in Grant County, Indiana in 1872. There were 5 of them then. Samuel Dalton, his wife Ruth, and their 3 children. They purchased 80 acres of farmland just outside the town of Jonesboro, built a modest house, and began the slow, grinding work of turning soil into livelihood. Samuel was described in county records as a quiet man of good character. Ruth taught Sunday school. Their children grew up, married locally, and stayed on the land. By all accounts, they were unremarkable. And in rural Indiana in the late 19th century, unremarkable was the highest compliment you could receive. But there was something else about the Daltons, something people noticed but didn't talk about openly. They didn't socialize much beyond church. They never attended town dances or harvest festivals. When Samuel's oldest son, Jacob, married a girl from a neighboring farm in 1893, the wedding was held at dawn with only immediate family present. No reception, no celebration. The bride's family later told people it felt more like a funeral than a wedding. And when Ruth Dalton died in 1902, her obituary in the Jonesboro Gazette was exactly 3 sentences long. No cause of death was listed. She was buried the same day she died, which was unusual even by the standards of the time. The family grew over the next 2 decades. Jacob and his wife had 7 children. His brother Thomas had 4. By 1920, there were 18 Daltons living in Grant County, spread across 3 adjoining properties. They built their own small church on the edge of their land, a plain white building with no steeple and no bell. They called it the Church of the Redeemed, and for years only Daltons attended. The local Methodist preacher once tried to visit and was turned away at the door. He later wrote in his diary that the man who refused him entry, one of Jacob's sons, had eyes like a man who'd seen something he could not unsee. Then came 1927. That was the year everything changed. In the spring of that year, a doctor from Marion, Indiana visited the Dalton property. His name was Dr. Ellsworth Greaves, and he was part of a statewide public health initiative aimed at identifying and treating tuberculosis in rural communities. He arrived unannounced, which was common practice for these surveys. What happened during that visit was never officially recorded, but 3 weeks later Dr. Greaves submitted a report to the Indiana State Board of Health. The report was marked confidential and filed away in the state archives. It stayed there unread and unrequested for 69 years. When it was finally uncovered in 1996 by a graduate student researching eugenics programs in the Midwest, the contents were so disturbing that the student's advisor initially refused to believe they were real. The report contained medical examinations of 11 members of the Dalton family, and according to Dr. Greaves, every single one of them showed signs of what he called hereditary degeneracy. Dr. Greaves didn't use the word degeneracy lightly. In his report, he documented physical abnormalities, developmental delays in children, and what he described as moral deficiencies among the adult family members. He noted that several of the Dalton children had unusual facial features, that 2 of them couldn't speak properly despite being over the age of 10, and that the family appeared to be living in what he called isolated squalor despite having fertile land and adequate resources. But the most damning part of his report wasn't about health or hygiene. It was about bloodline. Dr. Greaves had asked questions about the family tree, and what he discovered made him contact the state authorities immediately. The Daltons had been intermarrying for 3 generations. Not distantly, not cousins separated by geography or time, first cousins marrying first cousins. In at least 2 documented cases, uncle to niece. The family tree didn't branch. It circled back on itself over and over, creating what Greaves described as a closed genetic loop. He wrote that the family appeared to believe this was not only acceptable, but spiritually mandated. One of the older Dalton men, when questioned, told Greaves that keeping the blood pure and separate was God's will, that they had been chosen, that mixing with outsiders would undo the Lord's work. In 1927, Indiana had some of the most aggressive eugenics laws in the country. The state had already forcibly sterilized over 2,000 people deemed unfit to reproduce. Greaves' report landed on the desk of the Indiana State Board of Health during a period when these programs were accelerating. Within 2 months, a decision was made. The Dalton family would be addressed. But this wasn't going to be a typical case. The family was too large, too insular, and too deeply rooted in their beliefs. Forced sterilization alone wouldn't solve what the state saw as a generational problem. So they did something else, something that wasn't supposed to be part of any official program. They decided to erase the family entirely. The plan was called the Grant County Rural Health Initiative, and on paper it looked like a benign public health effort. The Daltons were told they needed to come to the county hospital in Marion for mandatory health screenings. They were told it was law. They were told there would be consequences if they refused. Between May and August of 1928, 17 members of the Dalton family were admitted to Moran General Hospital. They went in groups of 3 or 4. They were kept for days at a time, and when they came home, they weren't the same. Some of them never came home at all. The family stopped attending their little church. The children stopped appearing in town, and by the winter of 1929, the Dalton properties were almost completely silent. The neighbors noticed, but no one said anything. In rural Indiana, you learned not to ask questions about things the state got involved in. What happened inside Marion General Hospital during those summer months of 1928 was never officially documented. There are no patient files, no surgical records, no discharge papers, but there are gaps. Gaps in the hospital's logbooks where pages have been removed. Gaps in the county death registry where entries appear to have been redacted. And there are stories, whispered stories from nurses who worked there, passed down through families, never written down, but never quite forgotten either. One of those nurses, a woman named Helen Pritchard, told her daughter years later that she'd been assigned to the special ward that summer. She said it was in the basement away from the main hospital floors. She said the patients there weren't treated like patients. They were treated like specimens. She described medical procedures performed without anesthesia. She described children strapped to tables. She described a doctor. She never said which one, telling the staff that what they were doing was for the good of the state, for the future of the white race. Helen Pritchard died in 1968. But before she did, she made her daughter promise never to speak about what she'd been told. The daughter kept that promise until 2003 when she finally gave an interview to a local historian. By then, she was in her 70s, and she said she couldn't die with that secret still locked inside her. Of the 17 Daltons who went to Moran General Hospital, only 9 came back. The others were recorded as having died of various causes: tuberculosis, heart failure, complications from routine procedures, but their death certificates were all signed by the same doctor, a man named Dr. Raymond Kessler, who was not a physician at Marion General. He was a STITAP-appointed eugenics officer. His signature appears on over 300 death certificates across Indiana between 1925 and 1932, almost all of them for people who'd been institutionalized or sterilized under the state's eugenics programs. After 1932, Dr. Kessler vanished from public record entirely. No obituary, no retirement notice. He simply ceased to exist on paper. The 9 Daltons who returned home were changed, sterilized. Certainly, but also something else, something psychological. They stopped speaking about the family's beliefs. They stopped attending the Church of the Redeemed. Within a year, the church building was torn down and the wood was burned. No one knows who gave the order, but the Daltons themselves did the work. They dismantled their own house of worship, board by board, and set it on fire in the middle of a January night. People in Jonesboro said you could see the flames from 3 miles away. By 1930, the family had been split up. Some of them moved to Indianapolis. Others went to Ohio or Illinois. They changed their names, not legally but socially. They stopped introducing themselves as Daltons. They stopped visiting each other, and most importantly, they stopped having children. Of the 9 who'd returned from Marion General, only 2 ever married, and neither had biological children of their own. The bloodline that Dr. Greaves had called dangerously insular was effectively severed. The state got what it wanted. The Daltons were cleansed, not through death, though some died, but through eraser, through silence, through the kind of trauma that gets passed down not in words, but in the refusal to speak at all. For 65 years, the story stayed buried. The Dalton descendants, those few who existed, didn't know what had happened. They knew their grandparents didn't like to talk about the past. They knew there were relatives who disappeared, explained away as having died young or moved out west. But the details, the actual events of 1927 and 1928, were locked away. Some families passed down recipes or heirlooms. The Daltons passed down silence. Margaret Dalton Hayes was born in 1931. Her father was Thomas Dalton Jr., one of the 9 who'd returned from Marion General Hospital. He never spoke about what happened there, not once. Margaret grew up in Indianapolis, far from the farmland in Grant County. Her father worked at a factory. They lived in a small house on the east side. They went to a normal church, a Presbyterian one, with a tall steeple and stained glass windows. Everything about their life seemed designed to be ordinary, forgettable, safe. Margaret's father died in 1973. At his funeral, only 6 people attended. Margaret asked her mother why the family was so small, why there were no cousins, no aunts or uncles. Her mother looked at her with an expression Margaret would later describe as pure fear and said, "Your father wanted it that way. Don't ask me why." Margaret didn't ask. Not then. But the question stayed with her. When she retired in 1993, after 30 years as a school teacher, she decided to look into her family history. She contacted the Grant County Historical Society. She searched through census records. She found the Dalton family farm, or what was left of it, overgrown and abandoned. And she found that photograph, the one with the 11 people standing in front of the white church, the one with 3 faces crossed out in black ink. It had been stored in her father's safety deposit box along with his will. There was no note, no explanation, just the photograph and a single piece of paper with a handwritten line. We were told this never happened. That's when Margaret decided to take the DNA test. She thought maybe it would connect her to distant relatives, help her understand where the family had come from before they'd arrived in Indiana. The results came back in August of 1994, and they didn't make sense. The genetic markers showed levels of inbreeding consistent with what the researchers called extreme consanguinity, multiple generations of close relative reproduction, the kind of genetic signature you'd see in isolated populations or royal families that had married within themselves for centuries. But the Daltons were farmers, not royalty, not an isolated island population. They'd lived in Indiana, surrounded by other families, other communities. There was no reason for this level of genetic concentration unless it had been intentional. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in with the comments. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? Margaret contacted the university. She demanded answers. And that's when they started digging into the historical records. That's when they found Dr. Greaves' report. That's when they found the hospital records, or rather the gaps where the hospital records should have been. That's when they found the death certificates signed by Dr. Kessler. And that's when Margaret Dalton Hayes realized that her family hadn't just kept secrets. Her family had been the secret, the thing the state wanted to erase, the thing that wasn't supposed to survive. Margaret spent the next 2 years trying to piece together what had actually happened. She hired a private investigator. She contacted other descendants, the few she could find. Most of them refused to talk to her. One man, a second cousin living in Ohio, told her to stop digging. He said, "Whatever they did to us, it's over. Let it stay over." But Margaret couldn't let it go because the DNA test had revealed something else. Something the researchers at Indiana University initially missed. Margaret had genetic markers that suggested she shouldn't exist at all. Her father, Thomas Dalton Jr., had been sterilized at Marion General Hospital in 1928. The records, what few existed, confirmed it. He'd undergone a vasectomy at age 23. It was documented in a log that had somehow survived, buried in the state archives. But Margaret was born in 1931, 3 years after her father was supposedly rendered unable to have children, which meant either the sterilization had failed, which was extraordinarily rare, or Thomas Dalton Jr. was not her biological father. Margaret confronted her mother in 1995. Her mother was 87 years old by then, living in a nursing home, her memory fading but still sharp enough when it needed to be. At first, she refused to talk. Then she started crying. And then finally she told the truth. Thomas Dalton Jr. had known he couldn't have children. The state had made sure of that. But he'd married anyway in 1930 to a woman named Elizabeth Corcoran. They'd wanted a family. They'd wanted to be normal. So, they'd made an arrangement. Elizabeth had a brother, unmarried, living in Kentucky. He'd come to visit in the summer of 1931, and 9 months later, Margaret was born. Thomas raised her as his own. No one ever spoke about it. The birth certificate listed Thomas as the father. Legally, officially, he was. But biologically, Margaret was the daughter of her mother's brother. Another layer of the same pattern. Another turn of the same closed loop. Margaret's mother told her that Thomas had insisted on it. That he'd said the bloodline had to continue, even after what the state had done, that it was the only way to undo what they'd taken from him. He'd believed even after Marion General Hospital, even after everything, that the Dalton blood was still chosen, still pure, still meant to be preserved. The trauma hadn't broken that belief. It had twisted it, made it desperate, made it secret, but it had survived. When Margaret heard this, she didn't speak for 3 days. She later told the investigator that she felt like she'd been living inside a lie her entire life. That her father, the man she'd loved, had been both a victim and a perpetrator. That the state had tried to erase her family, and in some sick way, her family had agreed with the state's assessment, but refused to disappear. They'd found a way to continue the very thing the state had tried to sterilize out of existence. And she, Margaret, was the proof, the evidence, the thing that shouldn't be. The private investigator Margaret hired eventually found 7 other descendants. All of them had similar stories. Fathers who'd been sterilized but raised children anyway. Mothers who'd been institutionalized but had somehow still given birth. Family trees that didn't add up when you looked at the dates and the medical records. The Daltons had been declared cleansed in 1928, but they hadn't been cleansed at all. They'd gone underground. They'd lied on birth certificates. They'd used brothers, cousins, anyone with Dalton blood to keep the line going. And they'd done it in complete silence, passing down not the story but the method, the how, not the why. In 1997, Margaret Dalton Hayes published a short article in the Indiana Historical Quarterly. It was only 8 pages long and it was buried in the back of the journal in a section reserved for genealogical research. The title was Eugenics and Erasure, the Dalton Family of Grant County. Most people never read it. The journal had a circulation of fewer than 1,000 subscribers, mostly academics and local historians. But the article existed. It was in print. It was proof. And for Margaret, that was enough. She wrote about the intermarrying. She wrote about Dr. Graves and Marion General Hospital. She wrote about the sterilizations and the deaths that might not have been natural. She wrote about her own father and the secret arrangement that led to her birth. She ended the article with a single question. How many other families were erased this way? And how many of them found ways to survive that we'll never know about? The journal received 3 letters in response. One was from a lawyer representing the state of Indiana stating that the events described were unverifiable and potentially defamatory. Another was from a descendant of Doc Raymond Kessler demanding a retraction. The third was from an elderly woman in Illinois who said her grandmother had been a Dalton and that everything Margaret wrote was true and that she'd spent her whole life afraid someone would find out. Margaret died in 2009. She was 78 years old. She never married. She never had children. When she was asked why late in her life, she said she didn't trust her own blood. She said she couldn't bring a child into the world knowing what was coiled up inside the genetic code. The investigator who'd helped her research the family kept all the documents, boxes and boxes of them, census records, hospital fragments, photographs, interviews. In 2012, he donated everything to the Indiana State Archives. It sits there now in climate-controlled storage, available to anyone who requests it. Almost no one ever does. The Dalton farmland in Grant County was sold in 2001. A developer bought it and built a small subdivision. 14 houses, neat lawns, 2-car garages. The people who live there don't know what happened on that land. They don't know about the church that was burned. They don't know about the children who couldn't speak, or the hospital in Marion, or the belief system that kept a family marrying itself for 3 generations. One of the houses was built directly over the site where the Church of the Redeemed once stood. The family who lives there now has 2 young daughters. They play in the backyard. They ride their bikes up and down the quiet street. And they have no idea that the soil beneath their swing set was once considered so contaminated, so genetically cursed that the state of Indiana tried to sterilize it out of existence. There are still Daltons alive today. Not many, maybe a dozen, scattered across the Midwest. Most of them don't know the full story. Some of them know pieces. A few, like Margaret, knew everything and chose to let the bloodline end with them. The others continue on, unaware that their family tree doesn't branch the way they think it does. That the names on their birth certificates might not tell the whole truth. That somewhere in their past, someone made a choice between extinction and continuation, and chose continuation at any cost. The photograph that Margaret found, the one with the 3 faces crossed out, hangs now in the Grant County Historical Society. It's in a back room, not on display. If you ask to see it, they'll bring it out. The 11 people are still standing there, frozen in 1928. The 3 crossed-out faces are still obscured. No one knows who drew those lines or why. But if you look at the faces that remain visible, you can see it. Something in the eyes. Something that looks like fear and defiance mixed together. The look of people who knew what was coming and believed they could survive it anyway. And in a way they did. Not the way they wanted, not the way they planned, but they survived. The blood continued. The secret stayed buried until a DNA test in 1994 pulled it all into the light. And even then, most people looked away. Because some stories are too disturbing to face. Some truths are too twisted to acknowledge. And some bloodlines carry darkness so deep that even science can't fully explain what was passed down generation after generation in the name of purity. The Daltons believed they were chosen. The state believed they were contaminated. Both were wrong. But both left scars that never fully healed. And those scars are still there, written in DNA, waiting in archives, buried under subdivisions where children play and have no idea what sleeps beneath.